What's a piece of common knowledge that you genuinely learned embarrassingly late in life? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the Vancher channel. Also, please share your thoughts on this video in the comments. Let's get started. Story 1. My parents had never put me to bed as a child. I had no real idea that people changed into pajamas for bed. Instead, I always slept in whatever clothes I was wearing after taking off my shoes. I didn't realize this was odd until college. Story 2. I have a friend who legit cried tears of joy when she found out reindeer are real. She thought they were mythical creatures. Story 3. I'm born and raised in Canada, but have family in Port Huron, Michigan. I grew up visiting them a few times per year, including some rural areas around Port Huron. About 30 minutes from Port Huron is a town called Yale. It has a population of about 1,900 people. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. I remember seeing signs for Yale as we drove around this part of Michigan when I was a kid. During a casual conversation with my husband last year, I found out that Yale, Michigan is not, as I had believed for my entire life, the location of the prestigious Yale University. I'm 36. I've been telling people my entire life my mom went to Yale. Turns out she went to the high school there. Answer: OMG, the part about bragging on your mom is so funny. I can't believe this didn't come up with her at some point for her to correct your misunderstanding. What a shock to find out something you believed that all your life was mistaken. Proper nouns can be tricky. I was like 35 when I found out that the Michelin stars people are the same people as the tire people. I thought it was just a common surname in France and they were started by different Michelins. Nope, same Michelin, different Yales. Story 4. I learned like 2 years ago that Carolyn Keene, the credited author of the famous Nancy Drew mystery books, doesn't exist. It's a nom de plume for a bunch of ghostwriters. I loved Nancy Drew growing up, and my heart broke more than a little that day. Carolyn was my hero. Story 5. As a kid in Norway, I was often thinking about how unsuitable Japanese paper walls would be there. With our weather with rain and wind, I vividly imagined waking up after a rainstorm with a wet paper wall over me, thinking the weather in Japan must be incredibly stable and dry. I think I was in my teens before the penny dropped that these were internal walls. Story 6. I didn't realize chipmunks were real animals. I assumed they were mythical talking animals from Disney cartoons. I grew up in Brazil, then moved to Texas as a kid. My only exposure to chipmunks was Chip and Dale. I suppose I never really thought about it until I was in college and visited a friend in North Carolina. We were walking around our college campus and a chipmunk crossed the sidewalk, and the truth hit me like a brick wall. I still get teased about it years later. Answer: reminds me of the time I was riding a gondola at Whistler and a seasonal worker from Australia, or NZ, told me the thing she was most excited about living in North America was hopefully seeing a squirrel. I was chill about it, but retrospectively, like maybe you don't have squirrels down under, but you have rodents of some form, right? Squirrels ain't that different, babe. I hope when she inevitably found one that it was everything she'd hoped it would be. Story 7. Not me, but a professor of mine. I took German in college, and my professor had no clue what a platypus was. The topic came up BC. We had an assignment to read aloud a description of a TV show in German, and everyone else had to guess what it was. Someone chose Phineas and Ferb and used the word platypus, obviously. At first, we thought our professor just didn't know the English word for it, and that clearly a man in his 30s had to know about platypuses, right? Nope. We watched in amusement as this man pulled up Google Images and literally squealed with joy. It was so incredibly sweet, and I think about it every time I see a picture of a platypus. Story 8. I was an adult when I found out that men and women have the same number of ribs. That's what happens when you grow up in the Bible Belt. Answer: I went to a Catholic primary school and was taught this same thing. As an adult in my mid-20s, I was watching a movie with my girlfriend where they said they couldn't identify if a body they found was male or female, so I obviously said, why don't they just count the ribs? I've never seen my girlfriend be more confused and amused since. She still tells the story at every opportunity. Story 9. That narwhals actually do exist. Up until I was 22 years old, I thought that because narwhals were the unicorns of the sea, that meant they were also fictional and simply too cool to exist in real life. Story 10. You should look people in the eye when talking to them. I heard, "Are you eyeballing me, boy?" from some military show as a child and thought that looking people in the eye was disrespectful. Still have no idea what that quote was about. Answer: it is disrespectful in some cultures to give eye contact. Some indigenous groups in Canada, for example. This can cause conflict in educational settings where a teacher might think a child was being rude and not paying attention when they are actually showing deference. Understanding cultural differences in communication can be really important for teachers. Story 11. Pennsylvania Dutch is actually Pennsylvania Deutsch, i.e. the descendants of Germans, not Dutch, like Holland. That was at about 2530 when realization set in. Answer: the people who named them weren't stupid or anything. It's because Dutch was a generic and perfectly correct word for German or something until relatively recently. The terms German and Dutch being so explicitly related to the nation-states of Germany and the Netherlands only really solidified into their modern meanings with the foundation of the German Empire in the 1870s. Story 12. It wasn't until I was in college that I realized pickles were just cucumbers in some kind of special juice. Answer: another level of this is finding out how many condiments and foodstuffs, etc., are actually an old way of storing harvest. A cucumber will not remain edible for long, but pickle them and you'll be eating them for months or years. Yogurt, cheese, fermented stuff like kimchi and sauerkraut, also ways of storing nutrients for use outside of the growing season. Story 13. That a nightcap can just be any drink. I was so disappointed to learn not that long ago that no one can teach me to make one. I thought it was its own cocktail with its own recipe. Story 14. One of my parents was a butcher. I cannot overstate how disappointed I was when I bought ground beef for the first time as an adult away from my parents. Turns out when the butcher isn't hand-selecting exactly what goes into the grinder for their own consumption, flavor takes a bit of a hit. Story 15. I learned this year that on Android and iPhone, you can hold a space bar and then move your finger around to move the cursor. Story 16. That, as someone who never comments on anything because of a dumb, irrational fear of saying something wrong, embarrassing, accidentally rude, you can really enjoy reading a thread and relating to a lot of funny things and actually feel comfortable responding to a few. Thank you all for sharing. I don't know why this thread was different, but I never usually have the courage, even if it's silly, and this made my night. Story 17. I didn't learn that uncircumcised wangs were the default setting until my college anatomy and physiology sequence. Answer: I'm 50F, and my baby brothers, my male cousins, basically all the boy babies whose diapers I changed, and my first serious boyfriend weren't circumcised. So that's what I thought all male body part were like. With my second serious boyfriend, the first time I unzipped his pants, I said something like, "Oh my God, what happened to your male body part?" Because he was circumcised and I thought he had suffered some terrible injury or something. It was so embarrassing. So yeah, I was 20 when I found out some male body part are circumcised and some aren't. Story 18. I grew up in Seattle and moved to D.C. for college and stayed. My first year I lived in Virginia and commuted in walking, though a heavily wooded area to the train once. I witnessed a prehistoric bird that I genuinely blinked, did a double take, and then tried to take a picture as proof. Turns out it was a turkey, and turkeys aren't just a domesticated animal you buy frozen in the store. Who knew? City kid stuff, I guess. Story 19. I am a highly educated guy, but for most of my life, I refused to take Tylenol PM. Somehow I thought it was Tylenol premenstrual. I was nearly 40 when I learned the truth. Story 20. Not me, but an ex-stepfather of mine made the funniest remark. We lived in PA at the time, and we were wondering what to do for the next several days as it was a free week for us, and we liked to travel. That is when he made the lovely offer to have us check out where Jesus was born, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I don't think I've ever seen someone's face turn so red from embarrassment and humility. He was 56 at the time. Story 21. I was in my 30s when I realized eggs get fertilized through chicken and rooster shenanigans. I thought the egg got laid and the rooster sat on it to put a baby bird in it. Story 22. That female dogs have periods. My entire life never owned a female dog or apparently run into a situation until one day I saw one wearing a diaper inside a friend's apartment. My mind was rocked. Story 23. That thunder is not made by clouds crashing into one another. ETA in my defense. I'm not an idiot. My Nana told me that's what it was when I was a kid, and it stuck in the back of my mind, but I just never spent the time to think about it till I was well into my 20s, and that was when it clicked. Story 24. Earlier this year, at age 34, I learned that there aren't labs full of animals done up like drag queens. Story 25. That red in the joke Q. What's black and white but red all over? A newspaper is actually red. Story 26. That tortilla chips were just fried, cut up tortillas. I just never made the connection. One is circular and soft. The other is triangular and crunchy. Only until I saw them getting chopped up and thrown into the fryer, I was like, oh. Story 27. Those house songs I listened to in the 90s that mentioned ecstasy were talking about substances, not being in ecstasy. Story 28. I was in my early 20s when someone asked me if I wanted stuffed shells, and I embarrassingly asked if that were seafood. Story 29. My mother just learned that sea cucumbers are, in fact, animals. Hilarious, since she's been eating them for years and is now absolutely distraught. Story 30. A napkin offered is for them. I think I was being polite by refusing and not being a bother, whilst dropping crumbs all over the place. Story 31. Fudge Inner Space. That film caused me so much humiliation and ridicule. In the film, Dennis Quaid gets shrunk down into Martin Short. Martin Short at some point kisses Meg Ryan on the mouth, and Dennis Quaid gets transferred over to Meg Ryan via saliva. Later, Dennis Quaid is seen in Meg Ryan's uterus, and there's a fetus or embryo or whatever. So 6 Yomi thought that's how you get pregnant, is from kissing. 13 Yomi knew what intimacy was, but didn't understand that's how you get pregnant. I still clung to the idea the saliva transfer was the key, until I got into a public argument with classmates over how women get pregnant, and I insisted it was from kissing because I saw it in the movie Inner Space. I still cringe about it 30 years later. Story 32. I found out like 3 weeks ago the difference between IST and daylight savings time, EDT. I mean, I knew the difference, but had never once seen a DTCDT referenced. I realized half of the year I've lied about my availability on email communication. Story 33. I learned penguins and polar bear live in opposite poles after I was a fully grown adult. I even bet people that is not true. Thanks video games for misinformation. Answer: the wildest bit about that is that Arctic and Antarctic stem from Arctos, which is Latin for bear. The Antarctic was named before it was proved to have existed in the 2nd century AD, but the first recorded sighting of it was in 1820. The Arctic was named for the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear, of which the Big Dipper is a part of. It was not known until way later that there were no bears on Antarctica, but it's interesting that the Arctic has bears, while the Antarctic does not. Story 34. At uni, I studied wildlife conservation and zoo biology, and in one of my modules, I set a near-perfect exam. Only one question wrong, which naturally prompted my lecturer to grab me after class to ask what the hell was wrong with me for the question. It was regarding enrichment for a bison in a zoo setting. Now, somehow in my life, I have never come across a bison or even heard of it from the UK, so that may explain it. So I had to take a wild guess, so I decided a puzzle feeder would be a good idea. A puzzle feeder is the kind of thing you'd give to primates to slow down their eating and provide fun and stimulation. Looking back now, the idea of a bison solving an intricate puzzle is hilarious. But at the time, I was so embarrassed and my lecturer was furious. Just a complete knowledge gap. You don't know what you don't know, I guess, but at least I know what bison is now. Haha. Story 35. I thought Lesbia is some Eastern European countries, and the people there are called lesbians. This was in teens, where I only heard the word lesbians with no context. Story 36. Tacos are Mexican food. I lived in Alaska, and the Taco Bell commercials about south of the border flavor and make a run for the border led me to believe that Taco Bell served Canadian food. Story 37. I just saw the LA street name La Cienega written out for the first time today. I've heard the name before and always assumed it was La Cienega. Story 38. It's pronounced Segway, but it's spelled Segway. Until recently, I thought Segway was just pronounced Seg. And then if you want the full word, you add way to the end. Not to be confused with the Paul Blart vehicle Segway. Story 39. I learned way too late in life that you can ask the waiter for a refill at restaurants. For years, I thought you only got the one drink that came with your meal. And if you wanted more, you had to order another one and pay again. One day, a friend casually asked for a refill, and my whole worldview collapsed. I was already in my mid-20s just sitting there like all those years I was dying of thirst for no reason. Story 40. Narwhals are real. I was 42 when my 7-year-old daughter told me they were real. I thought they were like unicorns, never saw video my entire life, only animated or cartoon drawings of them. Side note, I went down the rabbit hole and learned their horn is actually their left tooth growing out of their face. Story 41. That if you were in court and your lawyer didn't succeed in protecting you, defense, they went to jail with you. Story 42. That when you're bowling, you're supposed to wait for the people next to you to bowl first if they were there before you. I didn't think that it mattered until I found out while bowling with family once when I was 23. Apparently, my parents assumed I knew, but no one ever told me, stopped me from doing it, or made sure that I knew that was a rule anytime before then or while I was growing up. It's not a huge deal, I guess, just kind of funny, and it makes me wonder how many times I did that to people over the years whenever I went bowling and came across rude low. Story 43. Ennui is pronounced ennui. I learned this about 10 years ago. I thought the person saying it was just being pretentious. Story 44. That TVs are measured diagonally. Are other rectangular items like tables, walls, rugs, picture frames, paper, etc. measured that way? No, I dislike when people are made fun of for not knowing that, because seriously, how could you know unless you were specifically taught? None would just assume that's how it done. Story 45. Only about 2 or 3 people actually give a shoot about you, and even those few folks don't know everything about you. Story 46. Ponies aren't baby horses. Car tires don't have tubes. It's bystander, not bystander. You can spell letters. Story 47. I was a late teen when I realized Funyuns, fun onions, my thoughts. Oh, they're like onion rings. Also, Toys R Us, my thoughts. Oh, we are toys. Story 48. Literally just how to pronounce so many words that I'd only ever read LOL. And it's a lot of simple ones. I think it's because I'm partially deaf. So a lot of words I just didn't hear properly. Story 49. That electrolytes were real, and they were important for our bodies. I always heard electrolytes are added for flavor only on Gatorade commercials and figured they were not important, like some homeopathic shoot. When I was in the hospital and told my electrolytes were out of balance and to chill out on the Powerade, I was so confused. I was 20. Story 50. That the little tag on a zipper locks the zipper closed when you fold it down. I used a safety pin to hold the zipper on my jeans for my entire 20s. Story 51. I was in my 20s when I learned you can mail chocolate milk at home and not just buy it pre-made. When I discovered it, my friends interpreted it as I thought there were chocolate cows and still refused to believe I meant chocolate milk was factory made. For context, I am allergic to milk, so I did not drink it in any form while growing up. Story 52. Refrigerators don't auto-lock. When you open a refrigerator door on a hot day, close it, and have trouble reopening it right away, it's because the air pressure on the inside ends up lower than the air pressure outside. When I was a kid, I was told the refrigerator locked itself so it could cool itself back down, and I shouldn't try to force it open. Story 53. That you are to never confide your problems, your shortcomings, your struggles, practically anything from your past with acquaintances, and that you need to have very deep mutual understanding and respect for one another to seek any advice. Answer. Honestly, I think with the right amount of social acuity and ability to choose your words, I think it's very possible to do this with acquaintances for sure. If you want to be absolutely positive there will be no blowback, or you're not super confident in your ability to choose your words well though, then yeah, waiting until a more advanced state of friendship makes sense. Story 54. Women don't have prostates. I, a woman, found out age 27 when I saw a poster about prostate cancer in the doctor's waiting room and thought I should probably get checked. Credit to my doctor for keeping a straight face. Story 55. Old people have intimacy and like it, LOL, and actually know what they are doing way better than when you're young and selfish. Story 56. I was pretty old before I realized the general land masses of the largest countries. I genuinely didn't realize the U.S. is the 3rd largest country in the world. I thought China was way bigger. I didn't realize Canada was bigger than the U.S. and that Russia is so enormous that it's practically the same size as Canada and U.S. combined. And that's just Russia. If you go back to USSR, it was 16th the total landmass of the planet. And I knew Alaska was big, but didn't really comprehend it's about 15 the total size of the U.S. You can fit about 550 Rhode Islands into Alaska. Story 57. Literally last night I saw a reel where a mom and son were answering this question at 46. I learned that the little piggy who went to market wasn't going shopping. Story 58. That you should turn the shower on to heat up before getting in. I would always angle the shower head away from me while it heated up. Story 59. When applying lipstick, start from the center and go out to each side. Oh, don't do one swipe across the top and one swipe across the bottom lip. Story 60. There aren't invitations to funerals. You can just go and pay your respects. Generally speaking, if at a funeral home gravesite. Story 61. I didn't know that holidays like Christmas rotate forward by a day each year. So if it's a Wednesday this year, it'll be a Thursday next year. My 11-year-old daughter told me this. Story 62. I was well into my 30s when I learned pickles were cucumbers. I never liked pickles, so I didn't pay much attention to them and figured they were just their own thing. Looking back, the obvious lack of pickle trees should have been a dead giveaway, but hey, I just could not care less about pickles. Now or then. Story 63. Maybe not common, but just learn the English alphabet used to have a letter called a thorn that looked like this. It makes the th sound. Over time, it evolved to more a y. So when you see a place name like Ye Old Tavern, like on sign or in a movie, it's actually the Old Tavern, not yeah. Story 64. am not from the U.S., and up until my 20s, I didn't know that Texas has quite a long coastline. The way Texas is portrayed in film and media is desert and cowboys. So I thought it would be smack dab in the middle of the U.S. and completely landlocked. When I heard about the Texas Coast Guard, I thought it was joke, and then I was embarrassed. Story 65. I remember figuring out the correct spelling of February in my teens and thought I was living in a simulation. Story 66. At 38, why did the chicken cross the road to get to the other side? Is actually a reference to passing and passing over, with the other side being like, yeah, no, not life. No, one had ever explained it to me. Story 67. I'm Gen X and have 2 degrees. About 6 months ago, I found out ponies weren't baby horses. I always wondered why people wanted ponies if they were going to just grow up. I was picturing kittens. I feel very silly. Story 68. I was 28 when I found out lemurs were real. I just thought they were a Disney creation or something. Story 69. That disinfectant cleaners need to sit on the surface for minimum period of time. Disinfect properly. Story 70. How to properly fry an egg. I now know that it needs to be about 90 cooked, and you flip it for the last little bit. I used to flip it too soon and have it break. Story 71. I assumed reality TV crews followed the cast around all day, every day for weeks, and then edited the footage to create episodes they thought were the most interesting. I finally learned from Instagram or Reddit like a year ago in mid-30s that they have call times and set up specific times and locations to film. I basically thought everything show was like MTV's Real World in terms of constant filming. Story 72. The no passing zone doesn't mean don't pass the sign. It means don't pass other cars. I may have been too literal as a kid. Story 73. That just letting soap run down your body won't actually clean your jerk and legs. I didn't really get that one figured out till I was 21, I think. Story 74. Found out at age 21 that a couple means specifically 2. No more and no less. I used to think it was a vague term for a small quantity of something. Anywhere from 2-5, I guess. I found out at my old job when a customer asked for a couple scoops and I, irritated, mentioned to my boss that many people aren't specific enough with their orders. Story 75. Tying my shoes. I understood the concept, but I couldn't do it with regular success until I was an adult. Story 76. I thought Jimi Hendrix was white until I was like 25. I'd heard his music, known his name and known his face, but I never connected the 3 until then. Story 77. I was 28 years old before I discovered that Chicago is not directly above Texas. I got to skip my HS Geography class BC of volleyball practice and barely passed the semester, but I passed. And in college, I took a California-specific geography class. Pretty embarrassing to find that out on a live call with my bosses and peers. Very funny, but embarrassing. Anything east of Vegas is just back east for this Californian Lowell. Story 78. K9 units are a play on the word canine. Yes, I am serious. I learned that around age 40. I always just thought of it as some random abbreviation. Story 79. I had a roommate in college that shared with me her experience. Until she was in high school, she thought the hook on the back of a bathroom stall was a belt hook. If she was wearing a belt shed, remove it completely and hang it there before returning it to her pants after she finished. It wasn't until a friend noticed her belt being completely off after peeing that she realized you can unzip your pants without removing the entire belt. I think about this a lot. Story 80. Pull down on grocery bags instead of out. They're designed to tear free and pull the next one open. Doesn't work if you pull out, pull down. Story 81. I recently found out axolotls were real, not fictional. I'm 31. In my defense, they do look pretty fake. Story 82. A friend of mine was 18 before he realized girls didn't pee from their butts. This dude lost virginity before he found that out. He legitimately thought because they didn't have a male body part, then somehow it made more sense for them to pee from their butts. Omeo on top of that, he thought that's why they sat down to pee. Story 83. Living in a super temperate climate literally my entire life, it is normally 70 degrees all the time. The summer might be a little higher than 70 and winter might be a little lower. The concept of seasons and everything that goes along with them was only realized in my 30s when my DH introduced me to another side of the country. I never owned anything heavier than a lightweight jacket or sweatshirt. First time I needed a jacket for cold temperatures, I was like, where do I even go to buy that? It is almost laughable to stop on your way out the door, especially as a child, to put on shoes, boots, jackets, layers, etc. Not one single person bats an eye wearing flip-flops when it's raining. Parking our cars inside a garage at all times? Where would all your storage, game room, workshop, laundry room, etc. go then? Never once have ever parked my car in a garage. Winterizing anything. Someone once told me they winterized Thearpool that weekend. I'm sorry, you did what? People around here use Thearpools in January. Insulation. 90 of the windows in my house were installed in the 1960s. They are metal framed, have zero insulation, and if there is only a small draft, you are doing well. The outdoor-facing door I'm staring at has a quarter-inch gap running across the bottom of it that has been there for 10 years. This is every single house I've ever lived in. Story 84. I have two. For years, I thought that the word several denoted a group of 7 things. I always thought it was weird that only 7 got its own adjective. I also used to think that Sigourney Weaver was the name of the Xeno from the Alien franchise, as in a hive of Sigourney Weavers, or the Weaver Queen. Story 85. That trans people aren't just perverts in dresses. Source realized in my late 30s that the constant creeping sense of dread and depression and brain fog wasn't normal and got diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Raised in a conservative household, very anti-queer. Was taught to believe some truly ghoulish things about strangers who were just trying to live their lives. Fun fact, estrogen typically inhibits your intimacy desire and renders male organs useless, immediately shattering the doing it for a kink nonsense. Story 86. That rice is seeds. Saw a video of one growing the other day. Never once occurred to me to think about what rice actually is. It's just rice, isn't it? Story 87. At 15, I went to D.C. to visit with my mom and little brother. My little brother is obsessed with history and kept talking about the National Mall and how he really wanted to go. Color me shocked when I realized the National Mall is not, in fact, an actual mall. Story 88. That yellow, green, and red peppers are all the same vegetable at different stages of ripeness isn't true. Story 89. It's called breakfast because you're breaking the fast, i.e., you're not eating while you're sleeping. I don't know how old I was when I learned that, but definitely a grown jerk adult. Story 90. That the Beatles' name is a twist on the word beet. This whole time I thought they named themselves after the insect and thought the odd spelling was just British English. Story 91. I didn't know that there were layers in a lint roller until my mid-20s. I always thought that they were really expensive for no real reason. Story 92. The little arrow on the gas gauge tells you what side of the car the tank is. Cake can be made from scratch. It doesn't actually come from a box. Story 93. My wife didn't realize tongs opened. She thought it was a really tiny gripper and didn't get why people found them useful. She was 28 when I told her. Story 94. How to open a school locker. I'm in my mid-30s. Only BC my kids didn't know either, and I had to teach them, so I had to learn first. Right, left, right, Lowell. Story 95. I just found out 2 days ago that the Tim Allen movie The Santa Claus is actually about the clause in the movie and not just a fancy way to spell his name. All these years, I had no idea. Story 96. When I was 20-something, I went to an aquarium and I learned that seahorses aren't as big as horses. I thought they were giant and people could potentially ride them because of The Little Mermaid. Story 97. Mr. T and Mr. Rogers were never married. I don't know why I thought they were, but I learned they were most definitely not married around 22. Story 98. Don't put metal in the microwave. No joke. I probably would have blown up the classroom if the person in front of me didn't leave 3 seconds and I didn't know how to reset it. Story 99. I lived under a flight path, and as a kid I thought the sound of a plane flying overhead were the clouds rolling in. It didn't click for me until my college years when I moved away to somewhere not under a flight path. Story 100. That pickles are pickled cucumbers, and not just pickles. I legit thought they grew on a vine or something. Story 101. It's called a banana split, because the banana is literally split in half long ways with ice cream in the middle. Story 102. I was convinced that the Kremlin was another name for the Russian leader, not a place. I realized this 3 years ago. Story 103. My first time at Olive Garden, I was on a date, and when the waitress came over with the block of cheese and asked if we wanted cheese, I asked if it was free. My date thought it was the cutest thing ever that I didn't know it was free. Story 104. Memory unlocked from the early 80s. My older sister didn't know that Tasmanian devils were real animals. When I told her, she was so shocked and asked if they spun around in circles like the cartoon. Older Redditors will remember the cartoons. Story 105. I think I win this one. I must have been 15 or 16 when I finally discovered that pulling one of the shoelaces unties the knot. Up until then, I had always yanked at the loops until the knot was undone, sometimes having to pull the knot apart from the actual knot itself. Story 106. that you can divide odd numbers by 2. I was out to dinner with friends and was calculating the bill. It came to something like 49 or other. My friend unfortunately heard me mutter, "I don't think you can divide that by 2, which you can, apparently. I'm 29. Story 107. I recently learned that you are not supposed to rinse your mouth with water after brushing your teeth. Story 108. It took me a very long time to realize that most people do not make decisions based on what is best for the community. They make decisions based on what is best for themselves personally. Story 109. Not until I had my first kid did I realize humans had baby molars that got replaced by adult molars. I thought only the front teeth fell out. I guess I blocked out my own molars falling out. Story 110. I used to struggle to remember how many pints in a quart and how many quarts in a gallon. I could remember one was 2 and one was 4, but I couldn't keep them straight. I was almost 30 before it occurred to me that a quart is a quarter of a gallon. Story 111. I did not know that everyone's balls hung at different levels. Thought it was the result of a biopsy in my teens. I trust my doctor. I have not verified, but his explanation made sense. Story 112. I learned where female pee hole was in my 20s. I'm a woman. I was watching a nurse put a catheter for a female PT, and my mind was blown. I thought it was by the clit. Answer, I'm a nurse, and in nursing school, we had a hot teacher. I am an intimacy experienced man. I asked her about the pee hole. I honestly wasn't sure where the catheter went. She drew a pic. Later, she told me how pissed off she was at me for asking. We later dated for a year. I would tease her when getting intimate and stare at it and say, now I see where it goes. She was awesome. Story 113. Alaska is not located next to Hawaii, contrary to what my wooden United States puzzle would have you believe. Story 114. I remember being floored in high school when I learned that Quebec is in Canada and not, like it thought, in the Middle East. Story 115. That with a new thing of deodorant, the plastic thing that's on top. All you have to do is twist the bottom and it'll rise up and you can just grab it. The amount of times in my life that I fought that stupid plastic thing off is embarrassing. Story 116. I thought my hair was parted on the other side than it really was, because I didn't understand mirrors were flipped images until my late teens. Story 117. Felt like a failed parent when my 20-year-old son legit thought tomato sauce ketchup was a product that simply existed to cool down French fries. Story 118. That couscous is pasta. I thought it was a grain. I totally sometimes made couscous when I wanted something healthier than pasta, lol. Story 119. For a long time until last year, I thought mushrooms needed a specific cooking process. Like all food-grade mushrooms were not safe to eat until you cook them a special way. Story 120. Ozzy Osbourne was the lead singer of Black Sabbath. I am a DJ doing mostly rock and roll, and I still somehow didn't figure this out until my late 20s. Story 121. Putting a marshmallow in brown sugar prevents it from becoming hard as a rock, then can restore a rock hard brown sugar to softness. Story 122. My cousin, 35 learned late in life raisins are dehydrated grapes. This was a couple years ago. I still tease him about this. Oddly enough, he knew where prunes were from. Story 123. In her defense, intimacy ed in our state is terrible, but my sister didn't realize humans produce milk until her senior year of high school. Story 124. My ex didn't know that lambs were baby sheep. He found out at the ripe age of 29 as we traveled through Ireland. Worth noting, we were both attorneys. He was better book educated than I, and he loved eating lamb. And while my family was from Ireland, it might have been a real shakeup for City Boy to see. But still. Story 125. I didn't realize wild horses were a thing until this year. I saw a TikTok and thought it was AI. I am 40. Story 126. I just realized last year that you can hold sprint in most FPS games instead of tapping it repeatedly. I spent years exhausting my fingers like an idiot. Story 127. I was 21 when I discovered that glow bugs are real and not some made-up creature like a unicorn. I was absolutely delighted. Story 128. I'm in my mid-30s, and last week I learned the contraction for you all is spelled y'all and not y'all. It wasn't ever something I thought about before. I'm a great speller usually, and I had to be corrected in a slideshow, luckily before presenting. It was so obvious when it was pointed out. I realized I must have been thinking of contractions with will like you'll or ill or it'll. Still, story 129. That FDR had a woman on the side. I remember the moment. It was some sort of argument I was having with my brother, and my late father. I said something along the lines of, well, they just don't make them like good old FDR. There was a man who stayed true to his marriage vows, or something like that. Mind you, my brother and father had a strained, sometimes relationship, but in that particular moment, they both literally at the same time said, are you kidding me? He had a woman on the side. You didn't know that? LOL. I was crushed. Ha ha. Story 130. Never had a pet as a kid since I am allergic. The Indian clay that we found one day playing in the sandbox and smeared on my face was really the neighbor's cat shoot. Story 131. That albeit is pronounced albeit. I used the phrase in speech as I had heard it said and knew when and where to use it. But when I read albeit in text, I read it as albete and had no idea what it meant. Rather overused it in writing the year after I found out. Have calmed down now. Story 132. The silent treatment until the parent is ready to pretend like nothing happened is not a normal, healthy way to interact with their child of any age. Story 133. That there is a large population of the U.S. that has never seen the ocean. I grew up less than an hour from the ocean and spent a good amount of time there. Moved to the middle of the country, and there are a lot of people who've never been to the ocean. Story 134. I was 54 years old when I found out mandatory was not spelled and pronounced mandatory. And I'm not some casual speller either. I got the most gold stars in 5th grade. Story 135. When I bought my first house, it was several years until I found out that I had to change the air filter for the furnace. Before then, I had only rented, and most of those places had radiators, not forced air heat. Story 136. I found out this year that 2 milk is called that because it's only 2 of the milk fat. This whole time I thought they just took whole milk and cut it way down with water. Haha. Story 137. Just found out recently that aircon doesn't draw air from outdoors. Have been sleeping in a room with minimal air ventilation for a long time. I'm grateful to be alive. Story 138. I literally asked a similar version of this question today in text to my uncle, and his response was, don't drink and drive. Jail could have eliminated someone. 30 days felt like 3 years. That's actually solid advice and very Uncle Core coded TBH. Uncles should be the most cherished things in this world. Story 139. When I say I was today years old, I literally mean today. Well, I suppose at this point it's 3:15 a.m., so technically yesterday. I learned that the reason they make you make a fist when drawing blood is just to create back pressure. BT in your fist and the rubber tourniquet to force your veins to pop for them to get the needle in easier. Was talking with the med assistant doing a blood draw for my physical and just decided to ask because it's usually in the back of my mind while they're doing it. Story 140. Full moons rise around sunset and set around dawn. New moons set around sunset and rise around dawn. Story 141. That Sabrina and Samantha from Bewitched was the same actress and not sisters. To be fair, I grew up on the reruns from a very young age and made the assumption long before I could read. I was 19 or so before I happened to be watching it late at night and had the wait, what? Wow, I'm so dumb moment. Story 142. My dad made me feel like you had to get permits for everything. I was about 18 and a friend of mine fell into a wall at their house. Put a decent-sized hole in the drywall. I was like, oh shoot, that's gonna be so expensive. And they looked at me and was like, why? I went to explain you needed a permit to fix that. They laughed, took me to HD, and fixed it in like 20 minutes. That changed my whole life. Story 143. Me and many others of my classmates were around 12 when our teacher realized that we had no idea that the seasons in the southern hemisphere were flipped. For some reasons, that made her really angry. And to this day, I still don't know why. She actually was our geography teacher. So why did she take it so personal that we didn't know the things she was supposed to teach us in the first place? Story 144. I didn't properly know I was circumcised until I was in at least middle school. I knew what it was and what it meant, but I had no basis for comparison, so I didn't know what it looked like. As such, I was getting my checkup. The nurse gives me the cup for that part of things, and she says, be sure to pull back your foreskin so it doesn't make a mess or something like that. I go into the bathroom, put the cup down, and then I ask myself, so what am I supposed to... Oh! Story 145. I was 19 when I got mom to have a little more of the talk with me and said it was embarrassing how little I knew. Told me some of the basic stuff I should have learned in class by then, but never had any intimacy yet. Story 146. I thought that when you were dreaming, it was because your eyes had rolled to look at your brain while your eyes were closed. Story 147. Reading the comments here, I found out today that so many creatures, animals exist that people thought didn't low well. Story 148. I realized at the dinner table in middle school, I've always been mixing up Frankenstein and Einstein. My family will never let me live that one down. Story 149. That Ctrl-Z doesn't exist in real life. I spent way too many years thinking if I just paused long enough after doing something stupid, the universe would let me undo it. Turns out it does not. Story 150. My mom grew up being forced to take care of all the housework and was determined not to do that to us. Sadly, she overcorrected, and we never really did any chores aside from dishes. When I was 23 or 24, I called my mom, very embarrassed, and asked her how to clean the toilet. She went silent for about 5 seconds and then just said, "Yep, that's on me." Story 151. Am an uncircumcised male. I didn't know very late into my life that I have phimosis, and the foreskin is supposed to go back over the head. Story 152. I'm now 27 and learn at like 20 that planes make an emergency landing before they deploy the slide. Story 153. The crash test dummy in Mythbusters is named Buster because he busts myths. I just realized that the other day, and I've loved that show since it first aired. Story 154. Tea has caffeine. Learned that in college on a study abroad trip. Someone made a comment about needing caffeine and getting a tea, and I very confidently said, "But tea doesn't have caffeine," and got a very odd look from my professor. Story 155. I'm from the South, U.S., and thought sneakers were called tennis shoes for years and years. Similarly, chest of drawers. I was in my 20s when I realized it was a chest of drawers and not a specific type of drawer designed by some guy named Chester. Story 156. I had speech deficiency growing up, and seeing as English was my second language, I struggled with a lot of simple words. I sometimes made random noises to help me remember words better. One word that always stood out to me was "ackleast." I would pretend to sneeze as a kid to remember this word. I once had to present something in class in middle school years later, and my principal asked me what ackleast meant. I gave her an example and said, "Well, at least you didn't hit your head on the ceiling fan." The word I was trying to say was "at least." I was 10 already. Story 157. I never lived with my parents at their house. I never processed that people gather for meals until I grew up. Story 158. My coworker thought that the last ice age was just a movie and wasn't real. I just couldn't and left her there for my other coworkers to explain that in fact there was an ice age and that's how people got to the Americas. She just thought people were just here already. Story 159. How to drink water without crinkling the bottle like crazy. Never knew how everyone around me drank with such quiet grace, and I was stuck sitting in the corner, crackling like a campfire to stay hydrated. Story 160. I was in my 30s when I discovered that Madagascar was a real county and not a mythical county created for a DreamWorks film. Story 161. I found out that there are flying squirrels when one got into our basement, and my dad caught it in a window, well, with a fishing net. I was 12 at the time. Story 162. I didn't know that pasta was made out of flour and water. I thought they were crops that you harvested, and there were different variations, hence the different shapes. I found this out when I was about 19, am now 30, and my family has yet to let me forget it. Story 163. I thought coffee bean grinders were poorly designed because you had to tip the whole machine over to pour the ground beans into the coffee filter. In July of this year, I learned the canister in which the ground beans reside is removable. Story 164. That King Kong dies. I was wondering how he was going to get off the building and back to the jungle. Story 165. Fish don't die when you touch them. My dad told me that to keep me out of the fish pond. I realized at 26. Story 166. It's old wives' tale, not old wise' tale, even though I think old wise' tale makes more sense, since the meaning is outdated information, like someone wise once said, but now we know it's wrong. Story 167. I didn't realize until a few months ago, age 20, that you don't have to completely take off your belt to pull your pants down. You can just undo it. I would literally take off my belt and hang it on the hanger in public bathroom stalls. Story 168. It wasn't until my 30s when I started watching crime documentaries that I found out about carbon monoxide poisoning in your garage, poisonous flowers, etc. But seriously, how is a regular woman supposed to know about carbon monoxide poisoning if an adult doesn't tell you? Story 169. Believed swans were made-up creatures for ugly ducking stories only. Was only at 23 I saw a real one and was, wow, that's for real? Story 170. That London was like a legit city, like skyscrapers and shoot. I thought it was like a cool, quirky historical city. Story 171. That POTUS is an acronym for President of the United States. 33 years old and an American citizen. I wish I was joking. Story 172. Not me, but a friend who is his 60s learned this year that green peppers are just unripe red peppers. Story 173. Athens was named after the goddess Athena. Now, to be fair, I don't spend much time thinking about cities' name origins. But in hindsight, the city of Athens should have been a no-brainer, especially since many of the places to see are rooted in the myths and legends surrounding the Greek gods. But for some reason, that Athens Athena eluded me, and it wasn't until I was reading the information boards at the Olympic Stadium that I made the connection, seeing Athens and Athens written so many times on the same space. The funny part, or maybe just sad for our survival as a species, was when I made the connection in my outside voice, the person standing beside me let out their own little exclamation saying, "Oh yeah." Story 174. Limes, as it turns out, are not unripened lemons. I was told that by my sister when we were 8 and 10 years old. I got cock-blocked by that little tidbit in college because the girl thought I was an idiot. Fair enough, I say. Story 175. That oil changes need to take place at least every 3 months, and if you drive a whole lot, maybe even a little more frequently. I ruined one of my cars because I didn't know this. Story 176. That rescue dogs are 1, a thing, and 2, come from shelters. I was conducting a formal interview recorded for posterity at the age of 30 when the wife of a very senior renowned scientist mentioned they had adopted a rescue dog. And I said, "Oh, that's awesome. From like a fire station?" She said, no. Next question. I went home and told my wife, still confused. She laughed until she cried. Story 177. That mangoes do not come from mangrove trees. Learned that last year on a trip to Costa Rica. I'm 5. Story 178. I always thought the birds flying at dusk were just sparrows going home for the night. Nope, they're bats. Bananas grow upside down. Story 179. I was in my 30s before learning that machines sewed, mass-produced fast fashion clothing are made by people using sewing machines. I thought it was like a car assembly line where big machines did everything. Story 180. I didn't learn until I was 13 that green stuff and plant substance are the same plant. I thought plant substance was some sort of extra smoky tobacco. Story 181. As a kid growing up in the South, I genuinely thought East Asian people were incapable of growing facial hair. I had never met an East Asian, or really any Asian person, before moving away, and all the East Asian people I saw at tourist spots had that clean-shaven look, or I at least couldn't see facial hair. Now that I have access to the internet and live in a blue state city, I have met and seen all kinds of people from all over the world, including Asian people with facial hair. Story 182. How to tie certain shoelaces so they don't come undone easily. Info that would have been nice to know over the past few decades. Story 183. Tomato ketchup is made from tomatoes. I didn't like tomatoes as a kid and was utterly put off when I learned this. I assumed it was named that as they're the same color. Story 184. I didn't know that it's not normal to have nearly daily headache and neck pain till I was 19. Turned out I had been having migraines for as long as I can remember. I found this out when I was at my old psychiatrist's office, and I mentioned to him that his lamp was hurting my eyes when he asked me to take my sunglasses off. Story 185. I was in high school when I learned that Amsterdam was not in fact in Australia. I've lived in Europe my whole life. Story 186. The phases of the moon got me good. My first grade teacher told me it was the shadow of the earth. It always confused me growing up, but I never really questioned it heavily or thought too much about it. It wasn't until 2 years into my science education degree, while staring at a picture of the earth shot from the moon on my phone screen, that it hit me. I was so mad. Story 187. Not me, but my mom didn't know there were 2 holes down there, one for peeing and one for babies to come out of, until she had me. She thought there was only one, albeit quite handy, hole. Story 188. I recently learned at the ripe age of 34 that I had been mishearing the lyrics to Mr. Sandman. Turns out it's Mr. Sandman, give me a dream, and not Mr. Sandman, give me a drink. My husband thought my lyrics were pretty funny. Story 189. That cows don't just produce the milk we drink via some convenient genetic anomaly. They have to have recently given birth and be lactating. Humans keep dairy cows in calf. I may have been in my 30s when I learned this. Up to then, I simply marveled at how there was a creature that had a digestive system that turned grass into milk. Story 190. I'm not sure how common it is, TBH, seeing so many men learn it online after me, but I learned online in my 30s that you need to push up on your taint to get the last drops of wee out. My 82-year-old father is still habitually buying black underwear to hide the pee stains. Imagine how many men have gone through life just thinking it's normal to be leaking after every piss. Story 191. You can pop the child-proof cap off most medicine bottles, and there's a second easy-to-use cap under it. Just learned that recently, and I'm 54. Story 192. I didn't know what the word climax meant. I thought it meant something like aneurysm, and I thought jizz was slang for urine. I was in high school. Let's just say that Utah doesn't have the best intimacy education. Story 193. Scroll down to the images. I only realized at nearly 40 that they are the same plant at different stages. Story 194. I was maybe 20 when I learned Judaism was not just a religion, but a whole culture. I blame my private school upbringing and ADHD. Story 195. You don't grow pickles. There are no pickle farms, no pickle ranches, pickles aren't natural, and that the reason we saw tuna fish and not cow beef or sheep lamb is because there is a tuna plant you can use to make a sandwich. Story 196. I was about 36 when I found out that the chew toys in Walmart actually do make rabbit sounds. Never heard a rabbit sound aside from Disney and Looney Tunes. And dogs don't come running over "What's up, Doc?" Also, I know a guy who learned around early 30s that he had been misreading hand-washing signs all his life. Gross. Story 197. Not sure if it's that common, but I actually didn't think dugongs existed. I only saw them in One Piece and thought they were a fictional creature. Story 198. That trees, at least quite a few, grow leaf buds in the fall, early winter, right after dropping last year's leaves. Not in the spring. I made it decades without noticing that, somehow. Story 199. I also missed this. Soft drink versus hard drink, the difference is adult beverage, which makes it hard. LOL. Story 200. I learned just the other day that prunes are dried plums. I truly never thought about what prunes actually were, lol. I think I just thought they were some type of fruit. I was right, I suppose. That fruit is just a plum. Story 201. New England is in fact not a state in the U.S. I was watching the Super Bowl for the first time. Assumed the New England Patriots were from a state called New England. Story 202. Communication is truly key to making a long-term relationship feel safe and healthy. A lesson I unfortunately have learned far too late. Story 203. I thought original meant plain and boring because I based my understanding of the word on its use in flavoring as a child, especially crisps, chips. Edit. I got into my mid-20s before figuring it out. Story 204. Not me, but my sister. A few years ago, when she was about 27, she finally realized you actually have to pay to post things. She sent my two sons their birthday cards with no stamps on either of them. I asked what she thought post offices were for, and I guess she just hadn't really ever thought about it. I also had to explain to her at 16 that two women couldn't get each other pregnant. She'd learned about squirting and made the mistake. Story 205. Growing up, my mom would stretch the truth from time to time to get us to listen to her. Example, growing up, she would warn me and my older sister not to wear our tampons for too long, or we would get toxic shock syndrome, not the lie. And that toxic shock syndrome shocked your body's hormones, and you would start to grow male genitalia. I was in my JR or SR year in high school when I found out the truth, BC. My older sister was telling me a story about how she went to a slumber party when she was a JR in high school and warned all of her friends not to sleep with their tampons in or they will grow a wane. She learned the truth that night, and I learned the truth as she told me that story. Story 206. Non-native swagger here. I learned by age 17 that it is because and not because. My English teacher didn't notice the mistake for 7 years due to my handwriting. Story 207. You are not meant to swallow the toothpaste. Only learned when this dental hygiene lady spoke at the school when I was 14 and said, I'm sure you are all old enough that I don't have to tell you this. Story 208. I thought teeth were ever replaceable, as in if one fell out, another would grow in its place and that this would happen till you die. Found out that wasn't true at like 25 years old. Story 209. Not me, but I have a client in her 70s that believed her entire life that carrots were dyed orange. I set her straight, but man, WTF. Story 210. I found out that the phrase from the get-go wasn't from the get-go when I was somewhere between 25-30. I always used to wonder what the phrase had to with a gecko. I understood that it meant from the beginning. Anyways, I found out that there was no gecko way too late in life. Story 211. That not all eggs laid by a chicken become a chicken. I didn't know that chicken laying eggs is like women getting their periods. I learned this at 38. I'm 42 now. Story 212. That the seasons are caused by the Earth wobbling around its axis, not because its orbit takes it closer and further from the sun. I was my 30s when I learned this. I have a master's in science and everything. Story 213. At 39, I learned narwhals are real, supposedly, according to the news article where a guy eliminated a terrorist with a narwhal tusk. What's next? Taking out a school shooter with a unicorn horn? Story 214. Until college, I used to pronounce Aborigine as Borg-9 because of the actor Ernest Borgnine. Then I was sharing a Times crossword puzzle with my roommate and pronounced the wrong way as the answer to a clue. Much ridicule ensued. Story 215. I think I was 25 or something when I found out that loofahs, are not a sea sponge, but actually a giant zucchini type deal. Story 216. Honeycomb in chocolate bars is actually just sugar and baking soda, not actually from bees. I honestly don't know what kind of Willy Wonka nonsense I thought was going on in the Crunchy factory, but if it's any consolation, everybody in the room when I discovered how wrong I was mocked me relentlessly for a few hours. Story 217. The capital of Australia? I thought it was Sydney all my life. Turns out it's Canberra, a city I've never heard of until a few years back. Story 218. How to tie my shoes, LOL. I could only do it by making 2 loops and tying them together until I was like 20. Then I finally figured out how to do it the regular way from my wife showing me. Story 219. So it was only in the last 2 months that I have been taught and begun to chew food properly, like 20-30 chews, aiming for roughly the same unstructured consistency before swallowing. I had previously spent over 30 years chewing no more than 5-ish times per bite, just forcing down chunky food. It's only been since I started chewing properly that I realized it wasn't normal to be constantly suffering with reflux, chest pain, throat pain, and inflammation. It has also begun to solve so many problems I have had with overeating, weight gain, etc. Story 220. After 50 years, I learned that I had been peeling potatoes the wrong way. With the new potatoes peelers, you go down from top to bottom. I had been going up toward me, and it was slower and actually a little dangerous. Story 221. Not to put aluminum foil in the microwave. I was 25 when a coworker told me that, and I really thought he was kidding. IDK how I didn't blow up any microwaves growing up. Story 222. The Ice Age movies came out when I was a young kid. I didn't know mammoths were extinct until I went to a museum when I was probably 10 and was very distraught. Then at 25, I brought it up to a friend and went, at least saber-toothed tigers are still around, just to go through the disappointment again. Story 223. People who smoke pipe tobacco clean the pipe with pipe cleaners. Cleaning pipes is, in fact, the original purpose of pipe cleaners, not primary school craft projects. Story 224. I had never heard of summer-winter solstice until I was 25. Some people I was talking to were discussing one of them, and I was clueless. Story 225. Spit the toothpaste out. My husband taught me in college. I always preferred kids' toothpaste because the adult stuff tasted bad. Story 226. Number 1 is a P. Number 2 is a poo. Legit was like 25 when I first heard this. Asked my family, and they were all familiar with the nomenclature their entire lives. Not sure how I missed it. Story 227. That eggs expire. I won't tell you what big age I realized that, but just know that I'm probably lucky to be alive. Story 228. Yugoslavia means a land of South Slavs. Yugo meaning South in Serbian, Croatian Bosnian, Montenegrin. I'm from Slavic Eastern Europe myself, should have known earlier than being 30 years old. Story 229. That there is tons of variety food products besides the cheap basics. For example, with condiments as a kid, my parents just brought the cheap basic ketchup or mustard for my sandwich with basic cheap ham. I grew up only eating the same cheap product brands. Until my late 20s when I moved out and did groceries on my own, I was surprised to see the variety of food brands I never even realized existed. I love the spicy Whataburger ketchup. I had no idea the grocery store sold them. The different brands of cheese, hams, bread, and even flavors of sauces and ice creams. There are so many to choose from. I never ever looked so closely at the groceries aisle. I always automatically brought the same thing that my parents brought. It's so amazing exploring these other brands and food type. I've been learning about myself more. I have been able to differentiate myself. Story 230. I didn't know you couldn't put metal in the microwave until uni. Until then, I had been putting plates of food with forks, knives, and all in the microwave at my parents' house my whole life. They knew and never said anything about it, and nothing bad ever happened. Then I went to uni and attempted to microwave a can of soup. I'd opened the top to prevent pressure buildup, thinking I was being safe, and someone told me there and then never to put metal in the microwave. I learned later that something about the shape of the metal also comes into play, which could explain why we never had problems with the knives and forks. Admittedly, I haven't looked up the science, and just as a blanket rule, I never put metal in the microwave now. Story 231. For years, I believed that you got arthritis from drinking too much lemonade. I didn't find out until I was in my early 20s that arthritis is in fact caused by various things: wear and tear, osteoarthritis, autoimmune attacks, like rheumatoid arthritis, crystal buildup, gout, infections, genetics, and injuries, with age, obesity, repetitive motions, etc. I now realize that my misconception came about due to, as a child, asking my father what caused arthritis, my granddad had it, while purely by chance drinking a big glass of lemonade, and my father was merely making a disapproving comment on how much lemonade I was drinking. Story 232. I got to know Wave a lot that minutes use employee codes to look for a person's department and not with name. I worked at small staff places, so we knew everybody by name, and it was a close-knit people. Though we are a family, seems bad. It's not that bad. Story 233. That trains make the cute O-rings in real life. Learn it as of yesterday. I always assumed they only did that in the old tunes for just silly fun effect and all that. I grew up not close to trains and also in FL, so seeing thick clouds and nice crisp cold weather wasn't an option for me, LOL. Also 95 at the time. I'd see a train that was in motion, so that also made me think it didn't happen, LOL. Story 234. Care about your health until 30. Anything could happen. I recovered shortly. We pay the price for junk food, not moving enough, not training our minds. Story 235. Tortilla chips are made from tortillas. The circle triangle thing messed me up. Then, as the rabbit hole deepened, I realized that corn chips were from corn tortillas. Story 236. I had always thought the saying was play it by year. A year seemed like an exaggerated amount of time to use as a reference, but nonetheless it was an amount of time and we would figure it out during then. Found out later than I'd like to admit it is play it by ear. Which, I mean, makes sense, but wouldn't we reference an amount of time like, oh, we will figure it out when the time comes? I digress. Story 237. I learned way too late that Ctrl-Z works in more places than just Word. I spent years manually fixing mistakes in Photoshop, code editors, even Windows folders. Meanwhile, the undo button was right there like, bro, please. Story 238. I grew up watching Mary Martin's Peter Pan. Since it's a play, Tinkerbell is shown as a stage light that moves around. But as a kid, I just knew Tinkerbell as a moving light. Imagine my surprise when Tinkerbell would visit our house. We would see the light moving around on the wall, and we'd get so excited. I got my first watch when I was 15 and noticed how the sun would reflect off of it and make a similar light. I then pieced together that Tinkerbell only visited when my dad was in the room. I obviously knew by that point that Tinkerbell wasn't visiting us, but never put it together how it happened. My dad died this year, and it's still a memory that makes me smile. Story 239. I didn't know that polar bears are only on North Pole and penguins are only on South Pole. I thought both Arctic and Antarctica had both polar bears and penguins. I blame kids' cartoons for that. I'm too afraid to check if both have sea lions and seals. Story 240. When I was somewhere between the ages of 5 and 10, I was told that the kids who moved in behind us were half black and half white. I was so curious to see which half of them was white and which half was black. I figured they must be divided vertically instead of horizontally, or else it wouldn't be symmetrical and therefore wouldn't be equal fare. Story 241. I thought the saying was always, look a gift horse in the mouth, because if they'd looked in the Trojan horse's mouth, they would have found soldiers, and that the aphorism meant beware of random gifts from strangers. Story 242. I'm 37, and last year I learned that narwhals are in fact real animals and not a mythical creature like a unicorn. Story 243. That I didn't need to be conditioning my entire scalp for 30 years of my life. Shampoo goes on the top and conditioner goes on the bottom. Well, I've saved a ton of money on hair washing ever since a random hairdresser cracked this egg of knowledge over my head 8 years ago. Story 244. That men and women have the same number of ribs. Long story short, I was brought up in a religious home. I've long left that part of my life. And that whole Adam gave a piece of his ribs to make Eve thing was never revisited in my day-to-day. It was a universal truth to me for decades. Story 245. That bodies of water can be salt-free. Grew up in a coastal town with no real lakes and didn't know that fresh water was something that existed until Colkage. Story 246. I was admiring this weird cartoon character of an alien on my Mexican beer from Monstruo de Agua Brewery near Mexico City. I told my Mexican in-laws that it was very strange this brewery made such an odd-looking character for their beer. That's how I learned what an axolotl is and that they are real. I thought it was an alien cartoon character. I was probably 35 or so. Now I recognize axolotl toys, images, and other things in pop culture from time to time. Somehow went that long without noticing. Story 247. I had no idea the stripper poles themselves also twirled around and could not figure out how those people spun around like that without chafing. Story 248. I didn't understand the common recommendation to eat 5 portions of vegetables and fruits per day. I always thought that to be impossible and thought I was eating really unhealthy. I didn't get that you don't have to eat 5 portions of vegetables or fruits on top of your regular meals, but that you can eat them with your meals until I was 27. Story 249. Had learned that my friends' parents don't sleep in separate rooms like mine did. I thought that all parents sleep in different rooms. Story 250. Apparently jackalopes aren't real. I discovered this in front of entire family days before finishing 2 college degrees. Story 251. That gobki, common Polish dish, minced pork cooked in cabbage leaves, which means pigeons, isn't made from actual pigeons. First learned it in late 20s. To my defense, I never really liked it. Story 252. That corn dogs are hot dogs in a stick covered in cornbread. I always thought it was a corn dog because it was be on a stick or something. I still feelin' stupid about it. Story 253. My mother would always say, "Illy, my kid," sometimes "Illy, illy" when she would speak to me. I always thought it was her way of saying she loved us with some wacky inside family joke or something that I never knew and never felt the need to ask. She passed away 6 years ago rather suddenly. I realized like 2 years ago that Illy directly stands for I love you. I am 36. Story 254. I've had pets being around pets my whole life. I grew up with 4 cats, 4 dogs, 2 betta fish, and a salamander, as well as 5 people in a 2-bed, 1-bath trailer home. The embarrassing fact I didn't learn until about last year when I was 23 is that the number of litter boxes are supposed to outweigh the number of cats that use them. Meaning, while growing up in limited space with way too many pets, we had 1 litter box for all 4 cats to use. And for some reason, my parents decided cleaning it out, maintaining it would be my sole responsibility from the age of 5 years old. And this nasty jerk litter box was kept in a corner of the kitchen. I now have a singular cat who's perfectly healthy, but just naturally doesn't eliminate waste very often. She'll go number 1 about 3 times a day, and number 2 maybe once a day. Story 255. That it's rhinoceros, not rhinoceros. I am 44 and brought up in UK, so I can't blame it being my second language or anything. Story 256. That a 70 chance of rain means that it absolutely is raining in the area, but it's only covering about 70. Story 257. I thought the world was black and white due to media back in the 50s, and then color just magically appeared after that when I was a kid. Story 258. Would always awkwardly laugh along when anyone said Uranus, haha. Wasn't until I was 18 when I learned what anus meant and was able to put the joke together. Story 259. I thought quinoa was pronounced quinoa. 27 years of life, eating it so much. Got corrected, working at a salad bar. Everything changed. Nothing was real. I had to rewrite my whole life story. Story 260. That female body part have 2 holes. 1 to pee out of and 1 for baby making. I was 26 when I learned that. Story 261. That when my dog went to a farm when I was 5 that he was actually put down. I think I was 20 before I clued in. Story 262. You have to switch the company you work for every few years. It's the only way to make proper money. Story 264. That peanut butter comes from pine cones. Mom liked to feed the squirrels. I was like 15 or 16 at the time. Story 265. The USA never went to the moon. The CIA eliminate Kennedy. Obama bombed more countries than Bush. The U.S. purposely cased the Japanese and Asian currency crises of the 80s and 90s. The EU was started by the USA in order to control Europeans. Germany, Japan, and South Korea are still occupied by the U.S. military since 1945. The favorite thing for the U.S. government to do is start wars in faraway places and then sit back and let both sides burn each other to the ground while selling weapons to one or both of them. The USA started the Taliban Taliban in the 1980s from the Mujahideen, which the CIA also started. The USA also started and supported the Islamic State, which is simply Al-Qaeda by another name. Major oil-producing reserve countries are likely to be attacked by the USA: Libya, Venezuela, Russia, Iran. The rest have all already been infiltrated, dominated by the USA. That's it for the moment. That's it for this video. Don't forget to support Vancher and my second channel, Vanchus. See you soon.